What's up, everybody? Jeff here, and with a new edition of Malifaux coming, I'm super excited because we are going to be getting a whole lot of new lore in the very near future. We're going to be getting some faction books, which means we're going to get a ton of new stories, and that's always super exciting. But I want to talk today about some of the new stuff that's coming to the game, in particular the new keywords Banished and Ampersand, and where they come from in the lore. So we know a little bit about both of these keywords, and we even know a little bit about some of the characters that are in the keywords based on all of the lore that we have up until this point. But some of it is in hard to find places, and some of it's pretty old, so I thought it would be fun to go through it all and talk a little bit about what we know. First, let's talk about the Banished. Now, the Banished first appeared in the story Waking Nightmares, which is the one where Lilith and Nekima have their little duel, and then Lilith ends up down in the hole. At the very beginning of that story, Lilith is actually trying to recruit more allies so that she can face off against her sister, who is kind of doing the same thing. And Zoraida sends her off to the Banished pools, where she is going to try to recruit the Banished. Now, in this story, these creatures are described as a blend of fish and frog, and when Lilith meets with them, they take some time to think about it and then decide that they are not willing to ally with the Nephilim because the Nephilim are their enemies. We learn that the Nephilim actually hunt and eat the Banished, and even though Lilith tries to explain that that's kind of in their past and that that's not something that's going to go on in the future, they don't accept her argument and they end up fighting. And then Lilith beats them all up and leaves them dead on the beach and then gets scolded by Zoraida for handling it that way. Now, in Through the Breach, we actually learn a little bit more about the Banished, but before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about who the Sirens are. So the Sirens are a species of the Fae, and the Fae are the residents of Malifaux who have lived there since the ancient past. The Sirens lived in what is now the Sunken City, which was on the coast of Malifaux. And when the Tyrant Wars kicked off, Meridian, who is one of the instigators of the Tyrant War, actually enslaved the Sirens and forced them to fight for her. Then, after Meridian is defeated and the Tyrants are mostly all taken care of in one way or another, the Sirens actually stayed in the water, kind of split up and decentralized, and decided not to kind of re-exert their civilization because they were worried that they would incur Meridian's wrath again. But one of these Sirens actually rose up and decided that she was sick of all of the cowardice, and she wanted to be queen of the waters. But the rest of the Sirens didn't like that, and they actually kicked her out of their society, and she and her followers became known as the Banished. Now, they lived in this sort of gross area between the bayou and the ocean, and living there for centuries actually mutated them and caused them to look a little bit different than what we might know of as other Sirens or the Gibbering Hordes, who are their cousins. We learned that no one is actually sure if this Queen of the Waters is still alive, but now that we know a little bit about the Banished that are coming to the game, we know that they're going to be led by the Silken King. Now, that definitely seems like it's probably a reference to some relationship with the Queen of the Waters. Maybe he is her descendant, or maybe she's still kicking around somewhere and they're a couple. It's going to be really interesting to find out why the Banished are suddenly emerging and getting involved in the goings-on in Malifaux. But we do get a little hint in this blurb that eventually the Banished might team up with Titania again because they are the kind of followers of a Fae, and the Fae Queen is Titania. So it would kind of make sense that she would come trying to recruit them, and they certainly didn't seem like they wanted to work with Lilith in the past. Now, I don't know if it'll be that straightforward. Things tend to not be very straightforward when it comes to allegiances in Malifaux. But it's going to be interesting to see how things play out nonetheless. So just to touch on it really quick, there are some other things that are a little bit related to the Banished in the game of Malifaux already. Notably, we have the Gibbering Hordes, which are from the other side. And these are sort of the denizens of the deep of Malifaux, and these are ancient Neverborn who lived in the oceans and were sort of mutated and twisted by the pressure, as well as all the other horrible things that have happened over the course of history. And now we see them as these creatures that kind of look like Sirens or a variety of other creatures like that. The Gibbering Hordes also have some Sirens, including the Storm Siren, who run alongside them. And I think the biggest difference between the Gibbering Hordes and the Banished are going to be that the Banished are sort of their long-lost cousins who are mutated differently and in this kind of creepier way that we see in the art that's been released. So while they are related and they're obviously going to have some similarities, they are, of course, pretty different because of what's going on in their history. The other interesting thing is that we already have a crew of Gibbering Hordes models for Malifaux, because the Nekima Nightmare box is actually a bunch of Gibbering Hordes models who are hanging out back Earthside around the coast of Australia. They're actually the subject of a Through the Breach adventure, so I'll let you go check that out and read it for yourself to learn a little bit more about them. But I am going to be curious to see if there's any more crossover between the two games in the future, because I think this would be a good opportunity to introduce some more either official proxies for Gibbering Hordes models or to expand that range out a little bit more. If you're enjoying this video and you want to support the channel, then there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. The first would be to pick up some merchandise through my merch store. You can grab a t-shirt, a hoodie, a mug, a sticker, all sorts of cool stuff like that. You can also shop using my affiliate links, so if you're going to make any purchases from any of these companies, you can use the links in the description below to make your purchases, and it will go directly to supporting the channel at no extra cost to you. There's also a link for my Ko-fi if you would just like to give me a tip, or my Patreon if you want to support me longer term. I have a bunch of different tiers there, and there are all sorts of benefits available to people, such as early access to videos, ad-free videos, the opportunity to vote in polls about upcoming content, and extra entries into the giveaways that I run occasionally. But if none of that is your cup of tea, no problem at all. Just make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and leave a like on the video. It actually helps a tremendous amount. And if you want to go the extra mile, then consider sharing the video out with some friends who you think might find it interesting. The YouTube algorithm is not kind to small YouTubers, so that helps a whole bunch. Other than that, consider joining the Discord, also linked in the description, where you can come and hang out with me and the rest of the community and talk games. But with that, let's get right back to the video. Now let's go over and talk a little bit more about Ampersand. This is an area of the lore that I've been hoping was going to get fleshed out a lot more for a very long time. Ampersand is super interesting, and it's actually a place that we find out about very early on in Malifaux lore in an episode of Weird Chronicles. Von Schill actually heads over there, and we find out that this is a sort of remote town in the north, kind of northwest of Malifaux City, in a sort of desolate area. And this is a place where a bunch of rogue constructs have congregated. These are constructs that are sort of sick of being bossed around by humans, and they have varying levels of consciousness, but either way, they've decided to rebel against their oppressors and meet up at this town to sort of do their own thing. A lot of them really hate the guild, and some of them hate the Miners and Steamfitters Union because they were their oppressors. And we find out that some of them will do some mercenary work on the side, but primarily they're concerned with finding other constructs and sort of bringing them into the fold. You can think of it as sort of a refugee camp for robots. Now, Von Schill goes there to recruit Lazarus to his crew, and when they have a conversation, we find out some interesting things where Lazarus views human-made rules and norms as being very illogical, and he says that that's part of the reason why they founded Ampersand, because they kind of live by their own rules and reject humanity's rules. Morality and ethics, these are not things that they are particularly concerned with, and they think they're illogical. Now, I know that Ampersand was actually a location that was featured in one of the worldwide events that Weird did in the past, but I couldn't find any information about that, and as far as I know, that didn't really expand the lore out at all. It was just kind of a place that you could interact with in some ways. So we don't know much more about Ampersand except for the fact that a handful of other characters from the lore have actually either visited there or stayed there for a little bit of time. But we do know quite a bit about the Clockwork Queen, who is going to be the master in the Ampersand crew. The Clockwork Queen is actually mentioned in the first Through the Breach book, and she was talked about in the section about the Age of Heroes. This is a time during the first Breach opening when all sorts of bad stuff had started to go down, but a bunch of humans had sort of popped up and started fighting off some of the horrible things that were happening, and they became very well known and renowned among the people. There's a bunch of names in there that some folks might recognize, but the Clockwork Queen is one of them. But she was known for being sort of ambiguous as far as her allegiances go, and it wasn't exactly clear if she was a good guy or a bad guy. However, we then see her pop up again in the A Stitch in Time Penny Dreadful for Through the Breach. And she's actually a pretty prominent character in this story, and I really don't want to spoil it because I think it's something that you should play out with your Through the Breach group yourself and kind of go through the story and learn exactly what she's got going on. But in her little character blurb there, we do find out that she is an inventor, and she is known for creating constructs, and there's actually rumors that she is the ancestor of one of the prominent sort of engineers of today, but those are unsubstantiated, and we don't really know who that might be. We can definitely see that the art that we have now for the Clockwork Queen is very heavily based on the art that we got from that Stitch in Time adventure, although obviously some things have changed over the years. Speaking of the art, I thought it would be interesting to just take a quick look here and see if we can identify who these players are and talk a little bit about the way that they look, because I really, really like the art for both of these crews, and I'm excited to see what they both look like when they come out as actual models. So here we've got the Banished crew, and I very much suspect that the Silken King is this guy here because he's holding a dagger, and he looks quite stately in spite of all of his kind of weird things that he's got going on here. This big jellyfish thing seems to be the colony, and I think that's appropriate for a 10-stone beater to be a big chonky guy like that, and it kind of looks like a colony because there's a bunch of little jellyfish up around his neck area there. One thing I find quite curious is that none of these models really look like a hybrid between a frog and a fish, which is how they're described in their first appearance in Waking Nightmares. Although I think maybe they were just referencing the Gibbering Hordes in general, and maybe didn't have this idea of a distinction between the Banished and the rest of the Gibbering Hordes like we know now. However, we do see that a lot of stuff here looks pretty mutated and dirty and abused, which is one of the things that is mentioned because of where they sort of were relegated to live in this sort of murky water between the bayou and the ocean. We see that these guys are not quite as clean cut as the rest of the Gibbering Hordes. So, for example, almost everything here has barnacles growing on them. Interestingly, that actually was referenced in their original story. And we even have some corals and other shellfish growing on a bunch of the other models here. Now, this little guy here is probably one of the totems. I suspect it's the urchin. And even though it doesn't look like a sea urchin, it looks like an urchin in the sort of colloquial sense. And he's got what kind of looks like a sickle there as well. He definitely doesn't give me abyssal anchor vibes, that's for sure. The silent siren is almost certainly this young lady here, and I'm curious if she's actually a siren in the sense that she's a fae from ancient Malifaux, or if she's more of a siren in the sort of mythological sense that she's gonna call to people and do bad things to them. Normally, I would say that the name is probably very deliberate and she is supposed to be a siren, but we also got Silent Snow last year, and that was not Snow, the character, so who knows. These three guys here are probably the Shorebound Sentinels, and their art here matches some of the abilities that we have on their cards already. And when I look at this crew together, it really makes me wish that they worked alongside the Pirate Molly crew, because I think they would look really sick, and we could have like a little Pirates of the Caribbean thing going on. But I guess we could just have them fighting each other, and we could still reenact Pirates of the Caribbean. Now, switching over to Ampersand, I already mentioned that the Clockwork Queen looks just like her older art, but she is a little bit more robot-y looking now. It seems like she has embraced the Omnissiah and decided that the flesh is weak, and switched out some of her fleshy bits for metallic parts. But we do see that the pose is very similar, and her outfit is also basically the same. Now, I think the stuff from her crew is pretty straightforward. We have the Fortune Teller, we have Steiner the Piano with the crossbow, we have the Bucket Bot, and then these minion robots are probably the mechanical misfits. Now, this crew is definitely a little bit weirder and wackier than I was expecting out of an Ampersand crew, but one of the interesting things that I noticed was that there's a description in the original story with Ampersand of a bunch of the other robots that are living at Ampersand, and nothing in this art actually matches any of their descriptions. We hear about a damaged rail golem and a calculator machine and a bunch of other strange and weird-looking robots, but none of these seem to match any of those descriptions, so I'm wondering if they're going to go back and pull from that lore and make some of those characters as part of this crew, or if there's a reason why they're not in it. I do like that everything here looks like it's kind of a mess and doesn't seem to really fit the aesthetic of any of the constructs that we see in the rest of the Malifaux world, because we do know that while they're living in Ampersand, they're doing their own maintenance and they're doing their own sort of upgrades and alterations on themselves. So it would make sense that over time they would sort of morph and change and not look exactly like any of the robots that we already know. Being that they all have some level of sentience, it also is kind of funny to me that they would customize themselves and add some weird accoutrement and kind of change their colors and all this weird stuff. So I like the idea that this is just a mishmash of the weirdest and strangest things that you could imagine a robot might do to itself. I would like to see some slightly more militarized looking robots in this crew, because obviously that is a big focus of a lot of the constructs that we already see in Malifaux, and some of them should still have some of that legacy. They do obviously have some of their original parts from whatever they were doing before. So like a half deconstructed rail golem or a rock hopper or something like that would be pretty cool to see added to this crew. Maybe even like a peacekeeper or a hunter, or at least parts from those types of constructs would be awesome to see included. I am obviously super excited to get more lore about the Banished as well as Ampersand and everything else in the Malifaux universe, but get down in the comments below and let me know which of these crews are you most excited about. Were you surprised by the art or any of the lore that we already know about them, and where do you hope those stories go in the future? If you missed it, definitely go back and check out all the other videos I've been doing about Malifaux 4th edition. It's really exciting. There's all kinds of really cool stuff going on. But that's all I got for you for today, so I want to send a huge thank you to the extremely cool kids here on Patreon, the Steam Proud Scoundrels, Dogmatize, Spanner Rider, Dynat, Rob Younce, and Tom Likely. And thanks for watching.